Welcome to Sunday Sermons from the Williamsburg Community Chapel, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Mark, chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. And I'll read verses 18 through 20 for us now, as we prepare to hear from guest preacher Reverend Dr. Brent Strawn, as he helps us continue in our summer sermon series titled, The King and the Kingdom. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled.
I couldn't help notice that Travis's kind invitation coincides with the July 4th weekend. And I've slowly come to realize that churches often ask me to preach on odd times. You know, times when attendance might be a bit low, near holidays, during summer lulls, leap year. I'm beginning to think that this is precautionary. Who knows what an Old Testament professor might say? Especially an Old Testament professor preaching on the New Testament. This is now the second summer that Travis is keeping me honest by giving me a gospel account to preach. Well, so just like last summer, I've been tuning in to the Chapel Podcast Network and have enjoyed listening to the previous sermons in the series. You might have noticed, if you've been doing that as well, or in your attendance here, that you'll notice something that I noticed, and that's that the series has jumped around a little bit, right? Pastor Travis took us up through Mark 1:20, but then we jumped to chapter 2, where Pastor Dale took us through verse 12. We then jumped a bit further ahead for Pastor Hunter's sermon on 2:23 to 3:6. And today we are skipping forward again, leapfrogging the rest of chapter 3 and all of chapter 4 to arrive at this story in chapter 5. That's how it goes in sermon series. You know, you just can't cover everything. But guess what? You can cover it in the Mark reading plan. Not once, but twice. So make sure to tune in on that on the Chapel Podcast Network and on the website. Okay, so this story from Mark chapter 5 that's before us today is a very famous one, and not least because it's found in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it is told in considerable detail. More detail in this story than any other story really in the gospels until you get to the passion narratives. But let's put Mark's version in context a little bit. At the end of chapter 4, Jesus decides to cross the Sea of Galilee, and so he and the disciples do just that. On their way, they encounter a terrifying storm, and Jesus stills it. And that amazing event prompts the bewildered disciples to ask, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the water obeys him. The sea obeys his voice. End of chapter, end of scene. New chapter, new scene. In Mark 5, Jesus and company arrive on the other side of the sea at a place that's called the country of the Gerasenes. Now, please allow me a brief digression here. You've probably heard about biblical scholars all your whole life long in sermons and so forth, and you've probably wondered, no doubt, what do these people really do for a living? I mean, really, what could possibly occupy them 40 hours a week, right? Well, here's one. Figuring out where the country of the Gerasenes is. I'm not lying. Believe it or not, there's a long-standing debate about that, in part because the various versions of the story that we have don't spell the name of the place the same way. The closest match is the modern-day city of Jerash in Jordan. But Jerash can't be right because it's 30 miles from the Sea of Galilee. That's a long way for those pigs to run. In my considered judgment, probably a little bit too far, and I am a professional biblical scholar. So another more likely option is a place now known as Cursa, which is right by the Sea of Galilee, but not everyone agrees on that either. So again, what do biblical scholars do all day? Disagree on things like this. But they also think hard about things like this, and when they do, interesting tidbits turn up. So here's one that I find quite intriguing. The name of this country, Gerasa, might be related to a Hebrew word, garash, which means to drive away or expel. Garash, Hebrew, is often translated in Greek with the verb ekbalein, which is the main verb used for casting out demons. So if Gerasa really is related to Garash, the story is telling us that Jesus has just arrived at Cast 'em Out County or Throw 'em Out Township. Yeah? Now, maybe that's a wee bit too clever, but the Bible is full of deep symbolism. Pastor Travis showed us that in Mark 1 with its many callbacks to the book of Genesis and Isaiah. And the story about the stilling of the storm in chapter 4 is yet another example. And so now here in chapter 5, the name of the country may signal that this story is not about a specific location on a map, but about something much, much larger. And so, not surprisingly, as soon as Jesus steps foot in Evicksville, a larger-than-life figure meets him. He comes to Jesus from the tombs because that's where he's been living. Mark reports that he's unclean, but that strikes us as a wee bit redundant, since living in a cemetery is not only odd, it would make you ritually impure. But this man from the tombs is not only on the fringes and strange, he's straight up scary. He's uncontrollable, unrestrainable, not even with shackles and chains. No one had the strength to subdue him, Mark says. Odd, scary, and strong, yes, but also sad. Verse 5 tells us that 24 hours a day, night and day, this strong and scary man went about screaming and cutting himself with stones. That is disturbing behavior, but it's also sad behavior, reflecting someone who's deeply troubled and profoundly unhappy. And we know why, don't we? This man was unclean because he had an unclean spirit. Now, once again, the uncleanness bit could be chalked up to corpse impurity. That's a big no-no when it comes to the Pentateuch. But it's actually much more than that, given the exchange between Jesus and this man, which reveals that he has a demon that calls itself Legion. Now, that's super scary. That's straight out of a horror movie, if you ask me. Now, if you remember Mark, especially if you're doing the reading plan, this isn't the first time Mark mentions an unclean spirit. There's a story in chapter 1 that we skipped in the sermon series that reports Jesus' very first miracle. It's in Capernaum, on the Sabbath, in the synagogue. There, Mark says, Jesus encounters a man with an unclean spirit. That's the same exact language as we have here in chapter 5. So, Jesus' first miracle on his home turf, as it were, is to encounter and exorcise a demon. And the very first thing Jesus does upon leaving his homeland and arriving in exorcism land, a place that is almost certainly not Jewish, is to encounter another demon-possessed man. This one, not a fellow Jew in a synagogue, but a tormented Gentile roaming about the countryside, unrestrained, in pain, self-harming. These two stories are parallel accounts, two inaugural miracles, if you will, and keeping the first one in mind casts some important light on what's happening in the second. And one such ray of light is that the spirit in chapter 5 is not unclean because this man has spent too much time in a cemetery. It's far more pernicious than that. So, this odd, scary, sad, and tormented man immediately accosts Jesus as he steps out of the boat. Mark tells us that the man ran to Jesus and worshiped him. Now, the ESV that you have on your worship bulletin says he just fell down before Jesus. And a verb that means just that is found in Luke's version of this story. But Mark's version uses a far more technical verb that means far more than just that the man collapsed in a heap, exhausted maybe by his jog over to Jesus. The verb that Mark chooses to use denotes a reverent posture. This man is bowing down or kneeling before Christ. This is a worshipful posture that shows extreme deference and respect. This man, or his unclean spirit, knows who he is dealing with. He, or it, is dealing with Jesus, Son of the Most High God. We don't know how this man or his unclean spirit knows Jesus' name or knows Jesus' status, but the unclean spirit back in Capernaum knew it too. I know who you are, it said to Jesus. You are the Holy One of God. Neither of these tortured individuals or their tormenting spirits particularly enjoy knowing this fact, right? Nor do they particularly like Jesus. In fact, both demoniacs, the Jewish one and the Gentile one, ask Jesus the very same question. What do we have to do with each other? That's an idiomatic way of saying we have absolutely nothing to do with each other. Zilch, zero, nothing. Stay back, stay away from me, Jesus. Both conversations, the one in Capernaum and the one in the land of the Gerasenes, also contain plenty of creepy details, right? In chapter 1, the Capernaum demon speaks in the plural. What do you have to do with us, Jesus? But then Jesus rebuked him, singular. In chapter 5, the man at first speaks in the singular. What do you have to do with me, Jesus? But we then learn that the spirit's name is Legion and hear about 2,000 demon-possessed pigs. In point of fact, the Greek text of chapter 5 switches back and forth a good bit, using the singular form here and a plural form there, which no doubt underscores the deranged nature of this man, but which also underscores his unnatural, or rather his supernatural state. This is creepy, spine-tingling, scary stuff. And things stay scary. Like the Capernaum demon, the Gerasene demoniac somehow knows Jesus' name and his status as God's son. That's something that no one else in Mark yet knows. And he also knows, or it also knows, that they come from two different worlds. And then things escalate. According to verse 8, Jesus had already commanded the unclean spirit to leave the man even before the spirit addressed Jesus. But now the unclean spirit has to fight back. And so the unclean spirit attempts to stop Jesus in his tracks, maybe even tries to perform a reverse exorcism of its own on Jesus. I adjure you by God, it says, do not torment me. Okay, well, adjure is a fancy word, right? That means to command someone under oath, to make them swear. So let's get this straight. A demon wants to do that to Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Really? It doesn't seem like it's going to work, does it? And maybe that's why the demon says that this adjuration is by God. That's the only way this play has a prayer. But again, a demon is making Jesus swear by God? It just doesn't seem like this is a good idea, not going to work. And maybe that's why the demon adds one more point, a pitiful ending. Please, the demon says, don't torment me. Don't cause me distress. Demons have feelings too, evidently. Or at least nerve endings. But not when it comes to those they hurt. We mustn't forget this poor, tormented, and distressed man from the tombs who was constantly screaming and cutting himself. Well, the demon's speech is impressive in several ways. You've got to give it credit, but it's too late. This unclean spirit is already defeated. He has already acknowledged who is superior by kowtowing before Christ. And Jesus has already commanded it to come out. But you got to give the demon some style points. It was a valiant effort. And perhaps impressed himself, Jesus asked the demon's name. Legion, it replies, because we are many. There's that creepy plural again. But the name Legion is creepy itself. Legion, the fact that the demon calls itself that the demon refers to itself as Legion is fascinating for a number of reasons. One of those is that Legion may not be a real name at all, but a way to just avoid or evade Jesus' question. In supernatural standoffs, it helps to know who you are dealing with. The demon already knows Jesus' name and is trying to force Jesus to do things like swear to God. Jesus wants to know the demon's name in return. And so it's quite possible that Legion is a diversion, just another attempt to escape what's inevitably coming to this demon. A second reason this name is so fascinating is because Legion designates a large number. Roman legions, and by the way, those are the OG legions, the original legions. Those were between 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers. The relocation of the demon into 2,000 pigs supports the idea that even if the name Legion is evasive, it isn't entirely inaccurate. We are many is super creepy, but also apparently true. A third reason why the name Legion is fascinating is because it is borrowed into Greek from Latin. And in Latin, it refers to a Roman military unit. And this story takes place in first century Palestine under Roman rule. In fact, the Roman 10th Legion was stationed in Palestine, and the insignia on its banners was, wait for it, a wild boar. The 10th Legion was responsible for a well-known raid against the city of Jerash in Jordan and its surrounding villages prior to the time that Mark wrote his gospel. In brief, this demon's name seems to somehow suggest or reflect Roman imperial occupation. In fact, several other details in the story add to this. The word used for the herd of pigs, for example, is a word that's typically used for military units. It's like a platoon of pigs or something like that. And when Jesus gives this demoniac, this regiment, this demonic regiment, permission to enter the pigs, the verb used is one that has military overtones as well. He dismissed them, is how it might be translated. And the same holds true for the verb used for the pigs rushing into the sea. It could easily be translated, they charged, again, with military overtones. And last but not least, this demonic legion doesn't ask to stay in the man. Isn't that interesting? No, they implore Jesus to not send them out of this particular country, this occupied territory. All of these details suggest that this story has some not so subtle anti-Roman overtones to it. A clash of two kingdoms, two realms is taking place in this story, and by the demon's own account, they have nothing to do with each other. But despite the demonic presence, these two realms should not be considered as purely or merely spiritual in some abstract sort of way. The clash happens in Mark 5 between two real people. These two realms are real. Flesh and blood, cut flesh in the case of the tormented demoniac. And that means, I think, that this clash is, among other things, about power and authority and politics and all the rest in various ways. Our sermon series is focused on Mark's presentation of King Jesus and his opposition to all other possible kingdoms, including King Caesar's of Rome. Pastor Travis has reminded us that the rival kings who want our allegiance are many. You might even say they're legion. They include king power, king economics, king identity, king reputation, king sexuality, king politics. The name legion seems to reflect king politics most directly, but in Roman imperial garb, replete with a Roman army in tow. Or at least one Roman legion. But the story in Mark 5 says it isn't just king politics at work here. No, it's got to be raised a little bit. It's God politics. Because Jesus doesn't encounter a flesh and blood general like Pompey or Titus or even the 10th Legion. No, instead, he encounters an unclean spirit, even if it's one that reeks of Roman politics. This demon is from another realm. It represents another kingdom. But this demon stinks of Roman occupation and all that goes with it. And the demon has taken all of that out on this poor, troubled man, wreaked it in his body and wrought it in his mind so that the only place he can live is where no one else wants to live, and all he can do is cry out and cut deep. So, no, this is not a political allegory. This is an exorcism. But we would be poor readers of Mark, I think, and poor hearers of the gospel if we also didn't catch the anti-Roman, anti-empire, anti-king politics stuff that's going on in this story. So while Mark 5 is not exclusively political, it is also political. And as a result, Mark 5 isn't solely spiritual, but it is also spiritual. Simply put, there is a lot going on in Mark 5. Thank you, Pastor Travis. Can't you give me an easy something easy in the Old Testament? There's so much to say about this story, more than I have time before me. And so rather than try to say everything, which is always a temptation when you step into the pulpit, let me try to narrow in on two big things. But please remember that I'm a guest preacher and an Old Testament professor. What do I know, really, about the New Testament? And also, don't forget the implied public service announcement whenever there's a guest preacher. The views of guest preacher, insert name here, do not necessarily reflect the views of Williamsburg Community Chapel. Okay, so here's the first of the two big things I want to say, and it's this, that I think the spiritual part of this story is real. Now, before anybody approaches me after the service to ask complicated questions about demons and spirits and angels and all the rest, let me just say I don't feel like I know a lot about that, but I still believe that this story is real. I believe it is true. I believe it is true that the Lord Jesus Christ and his Father, the Most High God, have enemies. Real enemies. Not because God wants enemies, you see, or cultivates them somehow, but because there are enemies who stand opposed to the Lord who loves them. Two of them showed up a long time ago in Capernaum and Gerasa. And at the end of the day, despite God's love, these enemies say to our Lord, what do we have to do with each other? Zip, zilch, zero, nothing. These enemies are real and they are frightening. And they have real power, frightening power. And they cause harm, even self-harm. They cause sorrow and distress and isolation. But listen to this. I not only believe these enemies are real, I also believe that these enemies can be and will be defeated. In fact, they already are. When Jesus faces off with this demoniac, his opponent is already bound down in deference and defeat. That's what verse 8 tells us, because Jesus had already commanded the unclean spirit, come out. But these enemies of God are crafty. You got to give it to them. They work the angles. They try to make Jesus swear by God. They look for exit strategies with minimal loss. But Jesus outwits them. Better yet, he outmans them, or best of all, he outgods them. He tells them what to do. He commands them to come out. He then dismisses them to a herd of unclean swine that end up not preserving these demons' lives, nor keeping them in the country at all, but rushing headlong into the sea. The sea. The sea, that symbol of chaos that Jesus had commanded and dominated just a story back. Jesus has sent those demons back to the abyss, you see, exactly where they belong. And the pigs drown in that sea, Mark says, exactly like another demonic king, Pharaoh, and all his legions had done way back when in the book of Exodus. Jesus' first step into the Gentile world has freed a tormented soul from demonic power and purged an entire country itself of the same. These demons will no longer bother any human beings, and they will no longer bother this human being who now sits clothed and in his right mind, no longer scary or sad, because to use words from Jesus in chapter 3, there is one who has come who is stronger than the strong man known as Satan. Jesus has come. Jesus is here, and he is here, according to that passage in chapter 3, to break into the strong man's house, bind him, and plunder him of all his goods. Listen to this. A tortured Gentile soul, isolated and impure, is one of the great treasures that Christ, the divine burglar, has come for. The other kingdom is put on notice. Yes, they already knew his name and they knew who he was, but now they know why he has come. He has come to rob them. He has come to rob them of everything. So yes, I believe this story is real and true, but even more than that, I pray to God that God makes it true and real again, today, here and now. So that's the first of the two things I want to say. The second thing I want to say about this passage is that while I confess the spiritual part of this story to be true, I also have to admit that it's hard to do that. I suspect I'm not the only one. If we are honest, I suspect we probably all acknowledge that it's kind of hard to believe in all this supernatural demon business. I mean, we are modern people after all, aren't we? And we're far too accommodated to a worldview that will have none of this spooky demon stuff. We're far more likely to believe that this poor man in Mark 5 had some sort of clinical condition, but alas, he lived before the DSM-5. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Manual Disorders. 5th edition, please. Copyright 2022. Jesus, the divine clinician, we think, knew the real truth and did what was necessary for the man. It's just that people back then didn't know. I mean, they couldn't know, at least not yet. And so they believed it all was spiritual, and that's why people wrote it up in all this religious gobbledygook. Now, maybe we wouldn't put it that directly, but we understand that kind of sentiment, don't we? I mean, culturally speaking, we don't have much patience for supernatural stuff in our world. Well, except when we do, like especially in suspenseful thrillers or religiously themed horror movies. And let's face it, they're all religiously themed horror movies. The Exorcism, for heaven's sake. But here's an interesting thing to note about Mark 5. It reveals that they didn't have much patience for that supernatural stuff either. When the pig herders saw what happened to their herd, they didn't rejoice about a divine miracle. They flee. They aren't upset about their financial losses, which must have been catastrophic. No, they just run away and tattletale. And so everyone comes out to see for themselves. The formerly madman sane, the formerly naked man clothed, the formerly unrestrainable man sitting peacefully right there next to Jesus. That's how drastic the change is. That's how thoroughgoing the conversion is. That's how effective Jesus has been. The old is gone, the new has come. Behold, a new creation. Thanks be to God. But how do people respond to that miracle? They're afraid, Mark says, so much so that they begged Jesus to leave immediately. They just couldn't handle this spiritual, spooky demon stuff. I can understand that. I mean, for the demoniac, Jesus represents salvation, the victory of the one true God over the kingdom of Satan and all its demonic forms. That is the good news of the gospel. When we are rescued, Jesus means peace and restoration and healing and everything good. The problem, of course, is when we don't feel rescued. Maybe the rescue was so long ago that it's hard to remember, or maybe we've become accustomed to some malevolent status quo. That seems to be what took place in Mark 5. For the people who witnessed the once madman, now sane, Jesus' presence wasn't cause for joy. Jesus' presence was cause for concern. What happened was uncomfortable. It seemed dangerous. Jesus is uncomfortable and dangerous in Mark 5. And that's true because Jesus is powerful. Mighty to save, we sing. Praise God. And save from what? Well, from demons, from legion, from Satan, from Rome, from king politics and all the rest. Yes, hallelujah for that. But we can't forget that this isn't the only exorcism in Mark. It's not even the first. It's the second. The first one was back home in Capernaum, in the synagogue itself. The demon there doesn't name itself legion or bear the marks of Roman occupation or really madness of any sort. No laceration, no isolation. It's just a regular synagogue attender, or so it would seem. But here too, even here in the synagogue, the house of worship, two kingdoms clash. What do we have to do with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? That's what the demon asked at the church service on the other side of Galilee. Two exorcisms, one Gentile, one Jewish, one pagan, one within the community of faith. And that is cutting really close to home, isn't it? Wish Mark would stay in his lane. It suggests King Caesar and king politics and all the other rival rulers aren't just out there, but in here among us. And that means it isn't just king politics or king economics or whatever else. Sometimes it's king religion. King fake religion, to be sure, but a powerful and compelling rival nevertheless. Now, this is where things get tricky and where it's hard to say this second thing I'm trying to say. Because I think it would be easy to let ourselves off the hook at this point. But if we do, that may well be to miss the claims of the gospel. The situation here isn't a matter of Christianity versus something else, especially our version of Christianity versus something else. I think the point of Jesus' two exorcisms, one inside and one outside the church, is instead that those inside and those outside the community of faith both can and do succumb to unholy powers. I think that's the point of two exorcisms in Mark. And that failure that gives in to unholy powers might be most damaging of all when king politics and king fake religion team up, united as one. Let me try to be as clear as possible. I don't think that believing in the true spiritual nature of this clash of kingdoms, this battle for lordship, means that our faith is ethereal, not about real things or real life, that it's altogether abstract or mystical. It is instead to say that our faith, in its best form, cares only about God, God's life, God's ways, God's precepts, God's commands, with Jesus Christ, our only Lord, our only Caesar, our only emperor, our only king, whatever term we want to use. Anything and everything opposed to God's rule and Christ's lordship is, according to Mark 5, demonic. And according to Mark 1, opposition to God's rule and Christ's lordship shows up close to home as often as it does far away. And we have to admit, that it's easy and tempting to go hunting for demons, am I right? Those people are evil or bad or whatever, just like that impure Gentile demoniac. But the two exorcisms in Mark won't let us get away with that. Sometimes it's us who are evil and bad, like that man with an unclean spirit who faithfully attended First Church Capernaum. And the way Mark tells his story simply won't permit us to demonize others. Mark's way of putting these two stories is that these two individuals were in or with an unclean spirit. That's the phrase Mark uses. But then at Christ's command, they are no longer with or in those unclean spirits. The unclean spirits have to be expelled, and they are, but their human hosts, the people in question, are not their demons. They are just people who are afflicted, miserable, worthy of mercy, deserving of compassion. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, Paul said, but against rulers, authorities, powers in this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil. Make no mistake, those spiritual forces of evil take hostages. Sometimes those hostages are us, but all the time, those hostages are non-combatants. In the end, though, I have to admit, I'm still struck by how these exorcism stories make us, uncomfortable. And not only because they're so pre-modern, I think it's also because we'd prefer a Jesus who is manageable. Not the Jesus who is the Holy One of God, Son of the Most High, on a mission to rob the treasure stores of hell and destroy its denizens. Our preference is for something else, something meek and mild, some milquetoast version of Jesus. And maybe that's just another kind of demon, this time of the slothful variety. Maybe we, like those ancient Gerasenes, have become a little too used to the demonic as part of our world. It's just the way things go. But no, not according to Mark. Something new is here. A new teaching with authority. Someone who commands the unclean spirits and they obey. I mean, who is this? Even the wind and the sea obey. Yes, Jesus is powerful, not to be trifled with, not by any demons and not by any of us. And here is the ultimate twist in the gospel. If we want to follow him, then we have to remember we can never forget what he did with all that unbelievable divine power. He laid it all down at a cross. Once, as he was being arrested, Jesus said, you know, if I wanted to, I could ask my Father to send me more than 12 legions of angels to help me. Once, Jesus said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting for me, but my kingdom is not of this world. Once, Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their own cross, and follow me. And once, Jesus looked across at a formerly demon-possessed man and told him, go to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, how he has had mercy on you.
Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we hope you will join us this summer as the Gospel of Mark teaches us that Jesus is the King and how his life initiates a new kingdom.